hmTV Matters.
Welcome, everyone, to our next installment of Education in Motion. I'm Donna Rosenblum, your host, and I am the Director of Education here at the Holocaust Memorial and Tolerance Center. So today, I am so excited that we have Dr. Howard Israel, who is going to be speaking about his new book and a lot of issues that he has uncovered in the medical field. So thank you so much for joining us and being with us today. I know that you don't live local, so this was, a definite commitment. So I appreciate that. Thank you again.
Thank you for inviting me, Donna.
Oh, wonderful. All right, so we're going to start off by first talking about your background, which I know leads up to a lot of the questions that I'm going to ask. But how did you get into the medical profession? Can you talk about your schooling, how it shaped you as a person, your family background a little bit, and kind of get into all of that?
Sure, yes. Well, the way I would describe my background is I would say I was the typical American Jewish baby boomer growing up in the 1950s and 60s. Okay. And in retrospect, it was a time where there was a lot of denial because it was maybe 15, 20 years after the end of World War II. Mm-hmm. I think my parents and my American Jewish family had a lot of denial. We stopped keeping kosher around 1960. We rarely went to temple. And it was a time, it was almost like, that was so horrible. That really couldn't have happened. Mm-hmm. And there was denial, of course, from the people who survived the Holocaust. But that was the era. We lived in the Bronx, mm-hmm. and I was fortunate enough to live a block away from Yankee Stadium. And I would say my religion was baseball. Mm-hmm. It was baseball, and Yankees. We used to see the games from the roof of our buildings.
Wow.
And I was very, very ignorant about the history of the Holocaust. I was a good student, but we didn't know much.
Right, it wasn't taught then.
It wasn't taught then. Mm-hmm. My American ancestors came over from Europe at the turn of the century.
Right, so there was no direct
connection.
So
I didn't have any direct connection, mm-hmm. but in a way I did. Mm-hmm. Because there was my only really living Grandpa Max, mm-hmm. who was my maternal grandmother's husband. She married in 1947, and my recollection of him as a child was this very quiet, passive man who walked around with a yarmulke, put on the tallis and tefillin, and would be reciting prayers all day long. He was from Poland, and I hardly understood much of what he said, but he was my Grandpa Max, and he's the only one I remember because my other grandparents had passed away. Mm-hmm. Well, I later in my life found out that this was his second marriage, mm-hmm. and that he was responsible before World War II to bring his entire family from Europe. Mm-hmm. He had brothers, sisters, wife, children, cousins, and they all perished. Right. And I only learned of this as I was growing up. Mm-hmm. And it kind of made me mad that he wasn't recognized for what he had gone through. Mm-hmm. And I still have the tallis that he gave me for my bar mitzvah, mm-hmm. which now means so much more to me than it ever did. Every year, it means more and more to me.
Yeah, that's amazing. So what inspired you to go to medical school?
Well, I was good in biology, and I was actually, my sister and I were the first graduates from college. So we were, that was cool. Yep. And I was good in biology, and I They said, I want to be a doctor. So what should I do? Should I go? I applied to dental school and I applied to medicine. And then I kind of pulled away from medicine because, I didn't want to deal with like life and death. Let's do something a little easier. The reasoning was probably not particularly accurate as you follow through. And when I got that acceptance to Columbia as a dental student, I said, this is it. And I went to school at Columbia's. It was at that time it was called the School of Dental and Oral Surgery. Now it's called the College of Dental Medicine, probably a better name. The first 8 weeks of dental school, we were in the exact same class as the medical students at the College for Physicians and Surgeons. We had to learn every part of the body in 8 weeks. Anatomy is pretty complicated. So here I am, like this 20-year-old kid, and the first day you walk in to an anatomy lab, you're not prepared to smell the formaldehyde, and then they take the sheets off, and you look at this mass of tan gray substance, and you go, oh my God. How am I going to get through this? I mean, that couldn't possibly have been at one time a human being, but it was. It was very, very difficult. And the required textbook was Grant's Atlas, which was like a comic book to me. I couldn't relate to it.
Right.
So I go over to my anatomy professor and I said, look, I want to do well. I know it's important. What do you recommend? And he was kind of a pompous guy, and he said, well, Howard, you can certainly get Pernkopf's Atlas, but you won't. I said, why? He said, it is so expensive, it is not within the realm of a student's budget. And he was right. It was really expensive, so I didn't buy it. And I had to just kind of sit around and suffer through the anatomy course with a lousy atlas, and I did okay, but I didn't really feel like I knew it. Then, as I developed in my career, I said, dentistry, but I really wanted to be an oral and maxillofacial surgeon.
Okay.
And that's when I was really introduced to the Pernkopf anatomy book.
All right, so let's tell us a little bit about that book.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, because that's really the crux of the issue here.
It is. Well, the first thing I do have to mention, because I do have to go home to Mindy, who's my wife of over 50 years, that she was working downtown. And she knew that I had that conversation with my professor a few years ago. She somehow remembered Pernkopf. And she bought the book as a gift for me, and it was for $50. Now, we're talking in 1977, that's like $500.
Yeah.
And it was my most used book that I had. And I used it for 20 years. Why? Because this Pernkopf book had pictures, anatomic pictures, that were so magnificent. They were so real that I would study that book day in, day out. And it was my ritual to open up that book before every major operation and study for that procedure I was going to do the next day. And my career grew. I became an academician. And then I became a professor, and I started teaching students. And the real funny thing is that I was so obsessed with making sure I knew my anatomy for 20 years, I would open up the book, and I would, the night before, and I'd have my yellow line sheet, and I would do the operation on paper the night before with my Pernkopf Atlas, going through this procedure, recalling the anatomy, because you never really, you got to review it.
I would think that
every single time, no matter how old you are, you can ask any surgeon.
And every person's body is a little bit different and unique. It's not, it's not like a car, and even then, cars are different, but they're set. I mean, a person is a person.
Yeah. And also, look, you're a human being. Nobody's perfect. Mistakes were going to be made in your life. And I made it my business that if a mistake was going to be made, for whatever reason, it wasn't going to be met made because I wasn't prepared.
Right.
And so I would write this all down on a yellow lined sheet. And then I'd go to the operating room the next day, and the residents would make fun of me. Look at Doc. What does the professor need a cheat sheet?
Right.
And I would say to them, well, folks, today we're doing this operation. I'm doing it second time because I did it last night.
Right.
So that was my regimen.
Wow. Amazing. So 1994 was a pivotal year. Something major happened that kind of transformed you in your professional career and as a person. What happened?
Yeah, 1994. Before 1994, my life plan was be a good father, be a good husband, earn a living, be great to your patients, be prepared. That was my formula.
A good formula.
Yeah,
I thought that was pretty
there was
good.
nothing wrong with it.
Nope.
And I was preparing for a surgical procedure. Had my Pernkopf book open because I was going to do operation the next day. And a colleague of mine just randomly knocks on the door. It's lunchtime. Howard, I want to say hi. How you doing? What are you doing? Oh, you're looking at oh, I know that. But you know that Pernkopf was a Nazi. I said, what? Now, here I've had this book for 20 years. But Pernkopf was my teacher.
Right.
He was my guide. You mean I learned from a Nazi? No, I couldn't be that stupid.
Right.
I couldn't be that ignorant. And then I looked at the pictures in the book, and then he said, oh, my God, did I benefit from this terrible, terrible time? So at that moment, and I was mid-career. I was at the height of my productivity.
Right.
And I said, I got to know. I cannot let this happen. Now, understand, 1994, 50 years after World War II. I'm first discovering that I'm using a Nazi anatomy book. So the first thing I did is I was at Columbia as a teacher, and I went down to the library stacks, and I found 1937, 43, and 52 editions of Pernkopf's anatomy book written in German. I open up the book, and I see the same pictures that I was studying from. The artists signed their names with swastikas and SS symbols, the rune. And, oh my God, it's true. I mean, this was produced at a time when, and that's all I knew. And then I looked at my book, my English language edition, same pictures, the swastikas were erased. 50 years later. And so this would not.
So who published the American edition, if I can ask?
Yeah, it was the American edition. My book was W.B. Saunders, but these publishing companies, they're very complex. The original publisher was Urban and Schwarzenberg from Austria.
Okay.
And that is important to remember as we move forward. Yeah.
So what did you do? I mean, what was the next step? So now you're faced with this situation,
I'm totally lost, and I have no idea what I'm going to do. But I felt I had to do something.
Right.
So the first thing you do is you go to the library, fortunately, the first person I spoke to was my rabbi, and she recommended reading a book by Robert Lifton called Nazi Doctors. And Robert Lifton wrote this book, Nazi Doctors. He was an expert, and he interviewed Nazi doctors, and he was trying to figure out, how does a Nazi doctor go ahead and do experiments and kill people and then go home and become the most loving father,
Right. You could say that about
husband.
all of them. How do you run a camp? How do you do any of the things?
How do they do
done?
it? And Lifton's book said doubling. It's a psychological process where you
Right.
could separate out the two.
Right.
So
Actually, just to make a note, one of our second generation and our docents, Dinah Kramer, tells her mother's story. And she talks about how one of the guards at the camp did the things that he did. He wore gloves, white gloves. And then he would take the gloves off and his hands would be clean. And he actually would make that statement. My hands are clean.
My hands are clean.
My gloves are off.
Yeah, and my gloves did it.
And that was the way he compartmentalized the, so that just made me think of that.
Well, you can also double.
Right. But she always, when she does her mother's story, she talks so
About
much
those
about
gloves.
the gloves.
Yeah, the gloves did it. Oh.
Yeah. Crazy. Yeah, I know.
So one day, this is just right at that time. I'm at Columbia Presbyterian. I still don't know what to do about this, and I go to throughout the medical center, and I see that I just read the book by Robert Lifton. I see he's giving the memorial lecture for Yom HaShoah in 1996. So I had a little chutzpah. I call up the secretary. I said, how is Dr. Lifton getting to the medical center? He lived in Lower Manhattan. He said, he takes the subway. I said, I'm going to do better than that. Can I give him a lift? I drove down. And you learn when somebody's about ready to give a presentation, you don't stop bugging them about your...
Right.
So I got to know him. Wonderful man. Gave a great presentation. And we just clicked. And then on the way back, I said, Dr. Lifton, have you ever heard of this book? Whatever. And he says, no, I never heard of this. But I know someone who might. And he referred me to a Dr. Michael Cater, who was a professor, expert on this in Canada. And I contacted Cater. Cater said, I'm not really the right person. The right person is Dr. William Seidelman, a professor from the University of Toronto, who has been in this arena since the 1980s, trying to expose the terrible things that happened in medicine and in academia in Central Europe, and to let the world know that this really happened and to memorialize the victims. And I connected with Dr. Seidelman, and I have to say that this whole thing was it was Bill Seidelman, myself. Now this is 1990s. Bill was my first email friend. And we emailed each other back and forth. And I kept notes of every single conversation, and I still save them. And Bill was magnificent. He had experience about uncovering the remains in a medical school in Germany called the University of Tübingen, in which the medical students in the 1980s were doing dissections on body parts that were from victims. And the University of Tübingen uncovered them, and with Bill's help, they wound up having a memorial burial of these specimens.
Oh my gosh. Wow.
Yeah, but I lucked out because he was definitely the right person. He was definitely the right person. So,
and do you know specifically about Pernkopf, where he was? Do you know any of no?
I didn't know anything. So, but before I met Bill, the other thing you do is you go to the library.
Right.
Unfortunately, we didn't have AI. We didn't have Google in those days, but we went to the library, and I found 2 articles on Pernkopf.
Okay.
And it turns out that I learned about who Pernkopf was, and it's a horrendous story. Pernkopf was an anatomist at the University of Vienna. The University of Vienna School of Medicine was the most prestigious academic institution. It became the model for medical education in the West. And they had Nobel laureates. I mean, they were prestigious, but understand between World War I and World War II, the rise of National Socialism, it became very important if you were going to have a career in academia, to be politically correct. And Pernkopf was an ardent Nazi who not only taught anatomy, but he also taught racial hygiene. And in 1938, he was named the dean of the University of Vienna's medical school. And I have a quote from his first faculty address. And when I read that quote, and there are pictures of him. So could you picture, this guy was a dean of a medical school, and he's talking to his faculty. And I won't read the quote, but I'll hit the last line on it. He's talking to his faculty, and he's telling them, you know, what's the purpose of medicine? The purpose of medicine is the exclusion. Racial hygiene is the exclusion of the genetically inferior from future generations by sterilization and other means. Could you imagine a dean telling his faculty?
Yep, that was the whole T4 movement.
That was
happening.
That was the whole medical movement.
Yes.
And that's why medicine was not. It wasn't just a bunch of crazy doctors. These were.
And these doctors then became part of the whole death camp movement after the T4 movement was exposed and shut down.
Absolutely.
It's amazing. It's just as an aside. Yesterday we were at a wonderful conference that was out at the Suffolk Y, and Milnick Manor for the Deaf came. And there were a couple of different programs, but my area was a kind of an intro to the Holocaust through some banners. The kids came in and they had to read the banners, and it kind of, and the kids were reading, and you could see that they were looking. They didn't know about the medical part of it, and so I explained with the interpreter how, if you were deaf, you would have been sterilized. You were defective. You were not somebody who Nazi Germany wanted to continue that line. And the kids, they were floored. You saw the light bulb going off. They were like, and I'm like, yes, this is what we're talking about.
Yeah, you have to teach them while they're young.
And they were really, so I said, yes, the Jews, and but there was a huge movement to have a master race of perfect people, and that was defined by the Nazi Party. It was really
life unworthy of life.
Life unworthy, and they were really, they were pretty blown away. So how did did you challenge the University of Vienna?
So, yes, we did.
Okay.
Bill Seidelman and I, as two individuals from the West, started writing letters and collecting information. We actually wrote an article in the Journal of the American Medical Association letting the medical profession know.
And what year was that?
And this was in 1996.
Okay.
And very soon after that, there was an article that appeared in the New York Times. A little side story, I had a patient who came to me by error. Didn't need an oral maxillofacial surgeon, but we were schmoozing for a while, and I found out she worked for the New York Times, and one thing led to another, and I was interviewed by the Nicholas Wade, the Science Times editor, and the article was published on the front page of the science section of the Times in November, and this article now made the public aware. So now the medical profession was aware. Now the public was aware. And so things started happening. And Bill Seidelman and I were able to try to get some feedback, and we didn't get too far. And the reason was in 1996, there were still some professors from that era. And essentially, the University of Vienna professors said, look, this is what we did in those days, but that's past.
And not dredge it up, yeah.
Yeah, and this one really got to us now. And by the way, they weren't Jewish concentration camp victims. Oh.
So that makes it okay.
Yeah. Oh, Israel and Seidelman. Oh, You think my moral compass is so low that that's what I care about?
Right.
And the publisher also wrote that too. They weren't Jewish concentration camp victims. What are you worried about? Excuse me?
Right.
We were fortunate in realizing that as individuals, we really couldn't get anywhere. So we then supplied the information to Yad Vashem. Okay. And this is all Bill Seidelman. Bill went to Yad Vashem, and there was a lot of back and forth. And Yad Vashem's ambassador agreed to write official letters to the university saying this is not acceptable. We need the truth. We need an investigation. And if you do have this history, you need to tell us who those people were who died, who are in that book.
Right.
And you need to acknowledge the victims. And if you still have specimens in your institution,
right, they need to
be memorialized and appropriately buried.
Right. Wow, amazing. So there's so much here. We could go on and on and on. But of course, reading your book, I'm sure all of this is there. So we definitely want to do that. I have two questions. Number one, what happened to Pernkopf's anatomy? Is it still published?
No, it is not published.
Okay.
It was published and hidden, for 50 years.
Right.
And many people knew, by the way.
I'm sure.
Everybody knew.
But now no longer.
But now it became an issue. The publisher decided that they decided to stop publishing the book. But anybody can get Pernkopf's anatomy because it is in medical school libraries throughout the world. Right. And the real issue is less the book and more of what do you do with information that could potentially save a life that came from such evil. The initial response is, no, you can't. It must be banned. The Nazis banned books, and there are others who. But if that's your moral compass, and you say it's just something I cannot. You're going to perpetuate evil. I respect that totally. But there's the other side. Hey, if that makes me a better surgeon, and if and it's such a great book, and if I'm saving lives. And a follow-up to this was a rabbinic responsum in 2017, where the rabbi from the chief rabbi, Rabbi Joseph Pollack from New England, he wrote a piece on this called the Vienna Protocol. And as terrible and as this history is, saving a life takes priority, but it comes with the obligation. You must acknowledge the source. You must acknowledge the victims. You must memorialize them. You must get informed consent. You have to let every single person in that operating room, the students, the staff, whatever. No. This is a lesson in ethics. When humanity goes sideways.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. And the last question is, what would be some takeaway that you would want our audience to be left with?
Well,
I know it's a hard one. But.
Well, I'm going to start from I'm going to go to the very end. I like astronomy. And so I look out into the universe, through a telescope. And when you start looking into this, and I'm not an expert, you realize that we are just a little teeny dot in the overall scheme of things. We have been given the gift of intelligent life. We don't know of any intelligent life anyplace else. How dare we say one is better than the other and murder them from that? So learn your history. My take home is learn the history. Know the history. Know that history, the only best way to predict the future is to look back on what we've done in the past. And unfortunately, these kinds of things, Holocaust, mass murder in Armenia. This is a repeat of history, and even after World War II,
of course,
just as bad. Learn from history. Don't be passive. Speak out. and call it out for what it is. And maybe there's some chance that we could take this world and become smarter and realize that as a surgeon, if I cut an artery, it's going to bleed red, no matter whether you're white, black, yellow, a Nazi, or a Jew, or a Christian. It doesn't matter. We're all the same.
Right. Well, that's why this is called hmTv Humanity Matters, because that is the essence of what we're talking about. So we could go on, and I would love to, but our time is up, and I would love to say thank you. This is riveting. I'm hoping that people want to now go out and read more about it. And for all of you out there, please like, share, subscribe. And until next time, it's Donna Rosenblum. Thank you so much.